Thank you, Scott. And just as a fun note about Crystal City, the documentary, it was most recently in Bratislava, Slovenia. So it's making the international circuit again. Not sure if that's the primary circuit, but Bratislava is, there we are. Okay, so tomorrow being Thanksgiving, obviously, I wanted to talk about gratitude. It's something we talk about probably every week here, but I think it's really important to focus on it specifically once in a while in a more formal way. So I wanted to just talk about 6 points that I think are important to practice gratitude and recovery that I thought of. And there's a lot more than this, of course. But the first point I think that's important is to really focus on what we have rather than what we don't have. I think a lot of people, it's kind of the glass half full versus glass half empty. And I think it's easy to focus on what we don't have, and especially in times like this. But I think so much, if we can get in the mindset of focusing on what we actually have and expressing gratitude for it, it really can shift our perspective. And so I think that's really something just to kind of reset sometimes if our attitude gets bad for the day or for the week, to really sort of shift a little bit. It's really useful for me to focus on what do I have? What do I have to be grateful for? And those moments when I'm least inclined to make a gratitude list or feel grateful are the times that I most need to do just that. And I know from experience always that if I just can do a gratitude list, and even this a brief cursory one, it'll change my mood and I'll feel better. And it'll kind of wipe away some of the toxicity that comes with those negative moods or feeling bad or feeling deprived or whatever that negative feeling of the day happens to be. So focus on what you have rather than what you don't have. I think another one is to ponder a recent life lesson that you've learned. I think sometimes we can start to think of ourselves as cursed or under the rain cloud or having different challenges. First of all, of course, everybody has challenges, and especially these days, everybody has challenges. But I think oftentimes, in my life at least, when I can look back on them, sometimes those challenges, those tough times were actually really turning points. They were kind of the gateway to some significant behavior change or shift in how I looked at my life and how I approached it. And so I think kind of remembering that when I'm going through those lessons, sometimes painful lessons, is that there's probably something here to be learned and probably something to be grateful for. And that, granted, that takes a little bit of time. If you're in that, in the middle of the lesson, sometimes it's hard to be grateful for it if you're not quite there yet. But I know from just numerous experiences and examples in my own life, if I can take something and learn from it and then be grateful for it, I usually find looking back that has added something to me and actually helped in some way. So really think about recent life lessons and what they taught us, including mistakes, by the way. I think a lot of us, everybody, of course, makes mistakes. And sometimes we addicts particularly, I think, can drop into a shame spiral and feel guilty and feel overly negative and self-critical. And I think sometimes if we can think about, first of all, that we all make mistakes, and the mistakes often, in fact, if not always, present opportunities to learn from. Make it a goal to give to others daily. And I think somebody might ask, why is that? How is that related to gratitude? And I think for me, practicing generosity is a big part of gratitude. So whether it's, putting a coin in there was a musician playing outside recently near me, and people were just walking by, and he was really good. And so I dropped some money in his little hat there, just a small token. But generosity in our attitude, generosity in terms of being kind toward people, giving people the benefit of the doubt. And we're all short-tempered right now. We're all feeling under the gun in many different ways. And I think that, I know I see it myself, it gets expressed in being short-tempered and kind of jumping to real negative conclusions sometimes. And that's all from being cut off on the freeway, so in real life, it could get really complicated. So I think we need to really kind of practice kindness and generosity toward others and just be there. In program, we have a tradition of service. And I think that is a hugely important concept that we can employ. And I heard a great thing today in group, actually, if I can get the wording right, but basically it was people were talking about their hesitancy to make a phone call to reach out when they're in trouble. And someone said, well, one phone call and two people are helped, right? It's not only the person dialing the phone, but it's the person receiving the call. And the same thing goes with sponsorship. It's that kind of service, I think, to others is really only benefits ourselves. Focus on the best instead of the worst. You know, we have this glass half full, glass half empty thing. You know, very often we fall prey to what's called negativity bias, which is, especially in addiction, negativity bias is simply just sort of noticing everything that's wrong in our world without really taking the time to pick out the good stuff. And it's fascinating to me that there's some research in neurology basically that shows as we start to understand how our brain processes information, there's so many bits of information coming at us in the universe that we can't possibly see and recognize and be conscious of everything. There's just way too much. So our brain selectively picks what we will see, what we're made conscious of. And we can train our brains over time to just notice the negative things in our lives. And some of that happens with trauma in early childhood, with hypervigilance. Some of it is just our personality. Some of it through the course of addiction really teaches us how to just see the negative stuff. And so really practicing a balanced view, you know, not just noticing negative, but noticing the positive. Notice that beautiful flower, that pretty bird that just flew over your head, or that gorgeous song that just came on the radio, and or the great food that's coming out of the kitchen, the smells, or whatever. Just notice it and be grateful for it. And just there's always something there to be positive and grateful for. And two more. Start viewing challenges as opportunities. This is a little bit related to that recent life lesson, but I think if we start looking at challenges as opportunities to grow, not only does it reframe the challenge and it helps us stop from feeling like a victim, which a lot of addicts can do, like, poor me, look what I have to bear, look what the burden I have, but really look at it as an opportunity to build resilience, to build self-efficacy, where we can feel empowered to be a little bit in control of ourselves, and really, and we can learn to overcome that victim mentality that I mentioned. I think just that is really critical to just, even if we're faced with a challenge, to see, okay, how is this going to help me? What kind of opportunity does this present? Where I can, if it's only surviving it, you know, that builds resilience as well, and knowing that we can get through something. But very often there's much more valuable lessons in these challenges in our lives. And then finally, take time to think about the things you're thankful for. And I think that's one of the biggest issues of gratitude sometimes, just making the time to be grateful and to do it. And for me, that usually comes, I try to do it daily in a ritual way, so it's not haphazard. And I do mine at the end of the day, but people do it in the beginning. You can do it at any time. Many times I've stopped my day in the middle of a crappy day and started a gratitude list just to, to sort of start over. But I think if we could do it in the same way each time, even for 5 minutes, and just do a quick little list, it really is therapeutic and helpful. And Scott, I can't remember if I got this from you or not, but somewhere recently I heard about a 30-day gratitude challenge. So I'm going to challenge everybody here to do a 30-day gratitude challenge, you know, which should beat pouring ice over your head on Facebook or Instagram. But a 30-day gratitude challenge is simply making a gratitude list for 30 days, 5 items. Just do it and see what happens to your life. I think you'll be surprised. And so with that, and what a great day to start that challenge than Thanksgiving, right? So thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Everybody type your questions into the Q&A feature. I too, David, make time every day for a gratitude list. I do a 10-item gratitude list. I do mine in the morning. It helps me sort of start my day in a good mindset. And I find if I forget to do that, I often have to pause at 11 a.m. or noon or somewhere and start my day over and actually do the gratitude list, because I get off on the wrong foot and I just kind of wander off in the wrong direction if I'm not grateful. Also, I just wanted to reiterate, because this is so good, one phone call helps 2 people. I just wanted to repeat that. no comments on it. I just wanted to repeat it. That's awesome. And there, by the way, there is research on the power of gratitude. Brene Brown, who I think probably most of us have heard of at this point, she did a whole bunch of research, and she wanted to find the difference between happy people and unhappy people. And she only found one difference between happy people and unhappy people. Happy people are grateful for what they have. And that's number one on David's list. Focus on what you have, not what you don't have. And grateful people, they focus on, the good in their life, and they're happy. They're also more likely to recover from illness. They're more likely to stay sober from an addiction, all kinds of things.
Longer.
They live longer. Yeah, it's amazing, the power of gratitude. And there is a lot of research that backs that up. So yes, big fans, both of us. Let's get into our questions. Like I said, type your questions into the Q&A feature. We are happy to answer questions about gratitude or anything else on your mind, as long as it's at least somewhat related to addiction and recovery. I found out my husband was using social media to cheat with random women he did not know after just a few months of marriage. And then over a year later, I found out there were a lot more women. At first, it was one message, no pictures, but this last time there were a lot, and there were pics and videos. He claims there were no physical encounters. I want to believe he will change, but I'm not sure if it's possible. He is also currently sober 4 years in AA, so he's sober from alcoholism, but does not believe that his sexual behavior is an addiction.
Yeah, okay. There's a lot in there.
Yeah.
Very often we see people, in fact, at Seeking Integrity, we get a lot of people who are in recovery from drugs, alcohol or drug use, and who don't recognize that their sexual behavior or porn behavior has become a problem until it all crashes and they find their way to us. But definitely, what we're finding is that, of course, we talk about staying away from porn, we talk about staying away from explicit stuff, but these days, social media, including social media that everybody has, Facebook, Instagram, and so on, there's a whole lot of kind of our almost X-rated pictures on there, a lot of skin on Facebook and Instagram. And I think it's very easy for people to go through and kind of use that to kind of titillate themselves with dopamine and flirt and start communication and so on. And that, as it sounds like this progression indicates, can lead to more things. Now, to me, it seems, and this is, I think, goes to his unwillingness to accept the fact that his sexual behavior is an addiction. He's acting out in an addictive way. And I think a lot of times when we see people parsing that or kind of picking at fine details, they might say, well, there are no physical encounters, but there's all this other stuff. And that's, to me, that's just a false distinction, because the addictive perusing was there, and then reaching out and the flirtation and the sending pictures. And frankly, I think it's just a matter of time until that would happen, or opportunity. So I think your husband has a problem. He's got a sex addiction that he's in denial about, and that's worrisome. I think he understands clearly 12-step program and how it works. He's sober in AA, but he really needs to look at the sex addiction part of his behavior as well. And I think you guys, the two of you, probably need to have a serious talk about this as well, and see what, you're not responsible for his behavior or controlling his behavior, but you can certainly set down some boundaries and expectations about what's acceptable for you and what's not. And that may be done if it's more comfortable with the help of a therapist or a couples therapist, but this is not a good pattern that you're describing. And so he needs to kind of get real about his behavior and his sex addiction, in my opinion.
Yeah, I want to add a few things to that, and then I have a question that I want to ask you, David. So yeah, a lot of times men or women who cheat think that, it doesn't count if there's no actual sex. And I've heard men say, oh no, it was only a hand job or oral. And they think they didn't cheat because there was no vaginal penetration. And we always say, well, ask your spouse how he or she feels about that. about whether it's cheating or not. Dr. Rob talks about this a lot in Out of the Doghouse. If you're keeping it secret, it's probably cheating. As a matter of fact, the definition for infidelity that Dr. Rob uses, I think he says infidelity is the keeping of important sexual or romantic secrets from your primary romantic partner. If you're keeping secrets about anything flirting or any kind of physical or just looking at pictures, you're cheating if you're keeping secrets about it. The other point I wanted to make is sex addiction. He may think he doesn't have sex addiction because he's not sleeping around. He's not actually having sex. Sex addiction is not about sex. It's about the fantasy that gets us out of our head. Alcoholism, the alcohol, the substance actually triggers a neurochemical reaction in our brain that sort of disconnects us from the stress and emotional discomfort of life. It's very easy to understand. I drink, I get drunk, I forget my problems until I wake up with a headache and the problems are still there. But sex addiction, it can be more difficult to understand. But the fact of the matter is, if I'm looking at porn or flirting on Facebook or sexting or whatever it is I'm doing, the fantasy creates the same neurochemical reaction and the same emotional disconnect. And that's the point of alcoholism. It's the point of heroin addiction. It's also the point of sex addiction. It's really not about the sex. In fact, actual sex and orgasm brings the addiction to a screeching halt. So sex addicts will often put that off for as long as possible because they lose the high once they have the orgasm, and suddenly they're thrown back into the real world, and maybe they feel guilty or ashamed of what they did, on top of the stress and emotional discomfort they were trying to escape before. So yeah, and addicts, we also have denial. I'm making a lot of extra points, but to say, there's no actual sex, I'm not a sex addict, but it's just part of denial. Well, I only drink beer. Okay, well, you still get drunk and black out. It still creates problems in your life. It's just denial. So the question that I wanted to get to David, it sounds like this individual is playing whack-a-mole or has a cross or a co-occurring addiction. How common is that? And this is one of David's areas of expertise here.
Yeah, so, Scott just described beautifully what addictions do. They help us disconnect from, unwanted thoughts, feelings, situations, and just kind of numb out and go off into fantasy land, whether it's through alcohol or heroin or porn or sexual acting out. So it's very easy for someone to get one of those symptoms under control. So in this case, get our alcohol under control. But if we don't deal with the underlying issues that's really driving that addiction, what is it that the alcoholic is trying to disconnect from or float away from or not feel? If we don't deal with some of that, and often it's trauma, if not always, those old trauma experiences, if we don't deal with that, the addict is just going to find another way to self-medicate. And so if alcohol is off the table, then they turn to somewhere else. And it's very common in terms of, there's I think between 40 and 50% correlation between drug addiction and sex addiction. So that means that basically nearly half of chemical dependency addicts are also sex addicts. And there's a significant number of sex addicts who are also, it's slightly less, but also drug addicts. So, there's a lot of this co-occurring addiction that happens. And by the way, it can extend to food and binge TV watching and shopping and gambling and a whole bunch of other things too that also help us kind of push and pull our moods in certain ways. So it's very common. I'm in AA myself. I sit around and look at them when I could go to meetings, look at the people in the room, and probably 40 to 50% of those people are also sex addicts and unrecognized. And frankly, in AA and a lot of NA, it's not really recognized. It's kind of supported. It's okay to kind of tell sexual war stories in a way that would be shut down if they were describing that with alcohol or other drugs. So there's a culture of kind of blindness towards sex addiction, I think, in some of the drug and alcohol recovery rooms. But yeah, it's very common, to answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, most of the people that I know, well, not most of them, but probably at least half the people I know in sex addiction recovery started in substance abuse recovery. Um, their life got a little bit better, but then it kind of stalled. And the reason it stalled was because of their sex addiction, their sexual behavior, or gambling, or something else that drove them into another program. I did it backwards. I got in sex addiction recovery first, then realized, oh, I need to quit drinking and using too. Um, but I had a therapist who described my life as changing seats on the Titanic. You know, the view changed from one addiction to another because I was a cross addict. I went from one addiction to another to another. I didn't do them at the same time. That's co-occurring. But he said, you're changing the view, but the ship is still sinking, and it's sinking really fast. And he was right. And eventually I had to get sober from all of my addictions for my life to really get better. So I hope your husband sort of comes around and recognizes that it sounds like he's using sex to numb out, basically, the same way he drank. So I hope he comes around. My brain, my addiction, lies to me and wants to isolate me, and it makes me think my wife is the enemy. Any advice to stop these crazy thoughts?
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing with addiction and how it can really mess with our heads and our beliefs and our thoughts. We often, I think the most powerful example of that is when someone is in that bubble or trance, acting out sexually, kind of doing their thing, and they're really kind of numb to the reality of the impact they're having on their partners or their spouses. And once that bubble breaks, then all that comes crashing in, and it's a lot of emotional pain. But with addiction, it's the same thing. It affects how we think, how we perceive. We are, from our personality point of view, the addiction is the thing that we're protecting most of all. It's like a lover or a primary relationship. And I think to protect it, we do all kinds of psychological defenses. Some are conscious, some are not. And I think the best way to make a list of those would be to look at what we call cognitive distortions, which, denial is one of those, the projection. And this may be a case here where we project onto other people around us negative characteristics and qualities, oftentimes that we see in ourselves, but we don't really want to recognize. But projection, black and white thinking, catastrophizing, right? We kind of, these are all filters that we take reality and we kind of skew it a little bit to make it fit. And then the reality in our brain is not really the one that's out there, but it's kind of skewed with the perspective. It's slanted because we're defending this addictive behavior. So there's a lot of thought processes. I think there's a couple of things I would suggest. One, mindfulness. The greatest tool, I think, just for self-awareness like that is just to practice mindfulness, which is really just to kind of stay in the present tense, be right here in the present moment, be aware of your feelings, be aware of your physical sensations, be aware of your thoughts, what's going on. Try to line it all up so you can see what's really going on when you have those thoughts, and not judge what's going on. So the goal of mindfulness is to be present, to observe without judgment. And by doing that, you can start to really connect the dots with what's going on. And sometimes, in fact, you can get kind of teachable when there are cracks in those defenses that we can start to see light through and say, wow, maybe there's a different reality than what I'm feeling in those moments. And then you mentioned one other thing that I just want to highlight it because it's so important, that where our addiction wants to isolate us. And I think, just like in a situation of domestic violence where the abuser is very controlling and wants to isolate us from our family and friends and support, and starts to limit money. And in many ways, the disease operates the same way, by causing us to kind of only focus on the disease itself, not bringing in other people, keeping a lot of secrets, isolating ourselves, self-selecting. Not only in my addiction did I isolate from anybody that would be good for me, but I sought out people who actually were worse off than I was in their addiction, so I could compare myself to them and think, wow, I'm really not so bad, look at them. So we kind of, our world gets very skewed. So I think just mindfulness, I would go to a lot of meetings. I think this is a thing where self-awareness is really important. I think good communication. Sometimes we have to talk to the people in our lives and be open to feedback. And there's some good structure for dialogues like that. So just, I think, awareness and a willingness to kind of put it down and realize what's going on and see, start to pick holes. You know, if you were in one of our groups, what we would do is start to look for discrepancies in what you're saying and where some of those, that denial might be coming in and where you're kind of skewing the story to fit a certain storyline that may not be the reality. So just, and that's often done, by the way, with the help of others. And so you might bring this up in your support groups. If you're in a therapy group, even better, or with a therapist, some other person, an objective observer who can give you some feedback on this and help.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. You know, in AA, we say we drink ourselves down the ladder. You know, we're continually seeking lower companions so that as we compare ourselves, we don't look so bad. By the way, ask us questions, type them into the Q&A feature. David mentioned, and you mentioned that addictions do isolate us. The process behind that, and we were kind of talking about this earlier, is it's usually sort of unresolved childhood trauma, neglect, abuse, teasing that's, you know, not the right, you know, not fun teasing, just things that aren't resolved, or alcoholism in the family or mental illness in the family. And what we learn as kids is that we cannot trust the people who are supposed to love us and care for us. We can't turn to our mother or our father for emotional regulation because we don't know what response we're going to get. We might get anger from them, we might get dismissed, and we internalize that, we start to feel shame. So rather than trusting other people with our vulnerability, our emotions, our truth, we'll turn to a substance or a behavior that just helps us gain some temporary escape. That's the stress and emotional discomfort that we want to escape. And this is very isolating. We can be around other people. Every alcoholic I've ever talked to said, I've never felt more lonely than in the middle of a big party, because we just don't really connect because we're afraid to connect. So we get isolated, and then our brains take over, and you know, our brains are ruled by shame often, and we just get a lot of mixed messages. You know, that walking through my brain alone is a very dangerous neighborhood for me to be in. So David really talked about it. Fact check. You know, reach out to other people and fact check. You know, this is why it's so important for addicts in particular, and but also partners of addicts, to have a support network. We need to be able to fact check. And I hope you have somebody in your life that you can talk to daily, or at least a rotating batch of people, so that you can have at least one recovery related conversation daily, because this is that's the best time to fact check. You know, call your sponsor, call your buddy in recovery, you know, somebody.
And I wanted to say too, that not only is it important to have that connection, as you say, Scott, but to really use it on the good days, so that when you're not feeling so good on a bad day, it's not such a big deal to make that call. I mean, that's the thing, to get in the habit of making those, to reaching out and having those contacts regularly, like Scott said, at least once a day, so that when the bad times come, you're not going to hesitate about bothering somebody with your troubles. You already have an established rapport, and you're used to calling and contact. So it's really important.
Yeah. Type some questions in. We've got one more to go to, and I've got one that I'm going to ask David right now. But we've got half a session left, so ask us some questions. This question says, you know, my addiction wants me to think that my wife is the enemy and treat my wife like the enemy. It feels like a lack of empathy, which I think is really common among addicts. Can you talk about how addicts sort of, if they had empathy, they lose it, and how they can get it back?
Yeah, so, you know, empathy, of course, is the ability to experience what someone else is feeling. And so it's a really phenomenal kind of ability that humans have. A few other animals we're discovering have it as well. In the last 10 years or so, we've discovered that what's called the empathy circuit in our brains. It's about 10 or 12 parts of our brains that are interconnected with this so-called empathy circuit. And the key to that being these what we call mirror neurons, which we're actually hardwired. They give us the ability to really read someone's feelings and feel them, which is an incredibly powerful ability, right? To really identify with people and bond with them in a very profound way. So that's really kind of the nature of how we're supposed to operate. What happens in addiction, and especially with sex addiction, because of the objectification of people, is that empathy gets cut off. People actually lose it. And so with people in sex addiction or porn addiction start to objectify objects of sexual desire, and sometimes down to body parts, or they kind of dehumanize people and think of them as sexual objects. It happens with methamphetamine as well. There's an incredible studies at NYU of chronic meth users, and they're showed pictures of faces with smiling, frowning, looking sad, the same person with different facial expressions. And the meth users asked, what emotion do you see? They were unable to distinguish any emotion on the faces. They were unable to experience any kind of empathy or read even what the person was trying to convey with their facial expression. And by the way, the one assumption they made was that the person was hostile. There was a little bit of a paranoid fear about what the person was really saying. But it's another case of how we lose the ability to feel what's going on. And so one of the important, essential, I'd say, steps in healing for a sex addict and porn addict especially, but for any addict on these kind of intensity arousal addictions, is to really kind of rehumanize people. Remember I talked before about how we train our brains to think in certain ways and see certain things. And over time, a sex addict is going to just kind of automatically objectify people. It's going to become the default position if they see an attractive person. And so it's critical to kind of reestablish the humanity of that person. And so one of the ways we do that are having spouses or partners write letters, impact letters, to describe what they've gone through. Or we teach people if they do see an attractive person on the street, instead of going right into that automatic objectification, to really remind themselves by conscious thought that this is someone's daughter or wife or sister, and it's a human being, not just a sexual object. And so that kind of recapturing that empathy is a huge thing, and it's a hard thing. It doesn't come easily. It takes some practice. I think we are defended. We're often disconnected, but it's really an essential skill to kind of reconnect and to heal. And especially if you're in a marriage or relationship that's been impacted by these addictions, it's going to be an essential step to learn how to not only empathize, but then to validate. I can see how you would feel that way, or I can understand and really kind of get it. And it's so profound to me when we do have clients, and most of our clients, in fact, when they come in, are still kind of unaware of the impact they've had on their partners, because they're in that kind of addict mindset. But when that kind of breaks open, usually through the power of these impact letters or some of the statement, when they realize what they've done, that's the beginning of learning how to create that empathy. And it's a huge flood of feelings when they realize the impact their actions have had in such a callous and kind of disregarding way for the people they love most in their life.
Yeah, it's sad that the people we hurt the most with our addiction are the people that we care about the most. But that's, the addiction fights back. It's denial. It's all kinds of craziness. And it's sad that we do it this way. Okay, this next one is a follow-up, and there are kind of two parts to it, and I'm going to take the second part first, but I want to sort of reiterate the situation here. We have a husband who is acting out mostly with social media. There's a lot of messaging, a lot of pictures and videos. He's 4 years sober from alcohol, but does not think his sexual behavior is an addiction. Both David and I do. So I'm going to take the second half of this question first, David. Is this a cycle that's likely to continue even if he admits it's an addiction, the sexual behavior?
So I think if someone really admits that's an addiction, it would be incumbent on them then to do something about it. And I think any anybody in recovery towards sex addiction, I think, would really question that behavior, even though it's social media, and really take a look at it. It's, as Scott said, it's not just the um, act of meeting someone. It's really the whole phenomenon of dropping into fantasy and going through social media to disconnect from feelings. There, he's off fantasizing about people that he doesn't know on social media, and by the way, getting a little dopamine hit at the same time, which is the core of addiction. And so, I think if he were to admit that was addiction, of course, I think that behavior would have to be looked at and challenged and stopped, because it's like, if okay, I'm an alcoholic, but I need to keep drinking six pack, doesn't make sense. So yeah, I think part of the issue here is the denial about, is that really a problem? And well, yeah, it is. And I think, again, people can minimize it, but we know that how it's working in the brain, what he's doing, is really part of this addictive behavior. So one would hope that it wouldn't continue if he were to admit it's an addiction.
Yeah, and sex addiction recovery is absolutely possible, just like alcohol recovery and drug recovery and gambling recovery. It's possible. The individual, the first step is to admit that there's a problem and to become willing to do something about it. And if he's willing to do that, there's a good chance that, yeah, he can get sober from this addiction too. Plenty of people are sober from multiple addictions, including myself. So yeah, there's hope, but he just needs to admit there's a problem. Okay, so the first part of this is this a type of relationship you would encourage someone not to stay in?
Yeah, so in my role as a therapist, I'm really hesitant to ever guide whether to stay or not, because I think that's really up to, that kind of choice is really up to the person. However, as Scott said, there people recover. I think I always have a lot of hope for these kind of situations, and it's certainly not a relationship that I would leave before I explored what remedies there might be. Because remember, I opened with a talk about gratitude and really looking at challenges as opportunities. And I think this could be an opportunity for healing at a certain level that actually could result in an increase in intimacy and healthy connection as a couple. So we can't predict what outcome it's going to be, but I would hesitate to encourage someone to leave or not to stay in if that's just not something I would do, at least right off the bat. But I think I would encourage a lot of attempts to look at what's really happening here in the situation. And then frankly, I did mention boundaries before. I think if those attempts are made, if the person continues to act out, frankly, my fear here, and I've seen this, is that this person is going to relapse on alcohol too, because these behaviors often escalate and start to combine. And so we've seen a lot of people with long-term recovery from a drug or alcohol who then got involved with porn or sex addiction, and then the whole house came crashing down. So I mean, it's a worrisome situation, but there's certainly a lot of intervention and attempts that can be made to remedy it between now and actually leaving, in my opinion.
Yeah, and Dr. Rob, in Out of the Doghouse, which is a book that's written for men who cheat and want to fix their relationship, but but it's equally applicable to betrayed partners. Almost everything in it is equally useful to betrayed partners. He has a chapter called "To Stay or Go," and basically it's a bunch of questions about, do you have fun together? Do you trust each other? Do you have a home and a life? It runs you through the sort of the checklist of like the positives and the negatives, to kind of help you get your brain centered about, there's probably a lot worth saving. I mean, if if this is a marriage, I think it's a marriage. Yeah. There's a reason you got married. You probably love this person and he probably loves you. So anybody who tells you, a lot of people are going to tell you what to do. Your mom's going to tell you what to do. Your neighbor's going to tell you what to do. You're the only one who can make that decision. Not even your therapist can make that decision for you. Your therapist might guide you through, the pros and cons so that you can make an informed decision, but you have to decide based on your own needs and wants and values. So yeah, and just to add to that, I have seen, I was on a drop-in group earlier, and I'll keep this anonymous, but one of the guys, an addict, was talking about how as he has become more open and honest and vulnerable with his wife, she has responded in kind by becoming more open and honest and vulnerable. And he said he really, really liked that and felt more intimate. And this kind of thing happens. Relationships can actually get better after infidelity, provided both parties will do the work of recovery. Relationships can be much stronger than they were before the infidelity because there's much more honesty and there's much more mutual vulnerability. Did you agree with that, David? Is that?
Totally. Yes, absolutely. I think it's very often when people can really work on it, the communication gets better, the vulnerability, the attachment, the intimacy, the sex. I mean, it all kind of improves because they're on the same wavelength. They're talking to each other, and yeah, I think it's totally true.
So this next one, I think this follows again from our cross and co-occurring addiction discussion. Is it important to attend meetings in each area of addiction, like AA and SAA and Al-Anon, if that's needed? So
I'd say yes and no. I think you can overload yourself with fellowships sometime. I think I know people that go to AA, NA, and CMA, and then they go to SLAA and SAA. I think if there's that many fellowships, I think it can kind of dilute the force of them. And the other thing I worry about is just not feeling at home in any one meeting, just kind of never being expected, never being accountable, just kind of floating around to too many meetings. I do think you need, if there's someone with multiple addictions, personally, I think it's probably important to have some kind of home fellowship for the drug side and a home fellowship for the sex side. There are some meetings, meetings like SLAA, I think, that are pretty comfortable for a lot of drug addicts, but it's really a personal choice. But I think that's important because, in my opinion, the AAs and NAs, even the CMAs, don't really cover any of the sex addiction material. For the large part, the people are clueless about them. As we mentioned earlier, most of them have them and are active in them. So it's problematic. And I think a lot of times the S meetings, the sex addiction meetings, don't really cover, because the abstinent model is not applicable in those meetings, so that it's a different kind of approach. So having one of each maybe is helpful for that. And then if there's, like an Al-Anon or one of those kind of partner meetings, then perhaps that's good as well. But I'd be careful about diluting yourself too much in terms of too many fellowships. But I think you want to make sure that you're getting everything you need from the fellowships, whether it's from the drug side or the sex side, without running yourself ragged trying to get to every fellowship. And then most people I know that do that maybe have one primary fellowship for sponsorship and things. The other thing, I think you want to be careful about having, like, you don't have several therapists, you probably don't have several sponsors, just because you can start to triangulate and get into situations where you're looking for the right answer and playing games a little bit. So I think I would do what feels comfortable, what works, but I wouldn't spread yourself too thin in fellowships. That's just how I feel. Scott, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. I mean, I am an alcoholic. I'm a marijuana addict. I'm a garbage can drug addict. I'm a sex addict. I'm the adult child of an alcoholic. And I have relationship issues that could be resolved in Al-Anon or CODA or Codependence Anonymous, which is a new fellowship. The website should be up in about a week, just as an FYI. If I tried to go to all of those fellowships or even half of those fellowships, I would make myself crazy. I need to be known in one or two fellowships. I live in an area where AA is really, really strong. And it's also a little bit more forward thinking than it can be in some spots of the country where they say, oh, you can only talk about alcohol in here, don't talk about drugs, the AA where I live, they're like, yeah, whatever. addiction's addiction. Let's talk about it. So when I went, but there was very little sex recovery when I moved here. So I tried to survive on AA alone for quite a while. And what I found was that I was getting in the car once or twice a month and driving 2.5 hours to Los Angeles to go to a sexual recovery meeting because I needed that fellowship too. So, and I have tried out Coda, I've tried Al-Anon, I've tried, and what I realize is I'm good in AA and SAA. As long as I am completely 100% known in both fellowships. I have friends in both fellowships. I socialize in both fellowships. I have sponsees in both fellowships. I only have one sponsor because I agree with David. One sponsor, otherwise you're playing them off of each other. If you don't get the right answer from me, you'll go to David to see if he'll give you a different answer. You know, but yeah, I particularly with sexual recovery. It just in so many ways, sexual recovery is unlike any other recovery, including the definition of sobriety, which is very, very individual in sexual recovery, whereas alcohol, abstinence, period. You know, drugs, abstinence, gambling, abstinence. Sex addiction, it's more about abstinence from the behaviors that are problematic for me. It's much more like we treat an eating disorder, you know. It's abstaining from unhealthy eating habits, whether it's binge, whether it's purge, whether it's binge and purge, whether it's anorexia, whatever. We need to learn to eat in a healthy way. Sex addicts, we need to learn to have a healthy sexual life. We can still have a scoop of ice cream. We just don't get the whole gallon. And sex addiction is kind of the same way. That was long-winded and all over the place, but yes, go to more than one fellowship, but don't go to 17. Any more questions? We're actually out of questions today. You guys have been very quiet as we approach the Thanksgiving holiday.
Wow. No questions. We usually can't answer them all.
I know, we usually have too many. We'll give it another 30 seconds if you want to type something in, and we can always wrap up early, which we've never done before. That would be so weird. I'm trying to think of something, but I'm drawing blank. Anything you want to just randomly talk about, David? I'll just throw it on to you.
Yeah, you know, I think I'm literally in my 8th hour on Zoom today, so my brain is a little bit fried. But maybe I could just reiterate the points for gratitude, and we can pull it wrap. Okay. So yeah, 6 points I started with tonight about gratitude. One is to focus on what we have rather than what we don't have. And that's just such an important point. As Scott mentioned, Brene Brown focuses on that, and people are happy. But just let's look at what we have. And even if we think we're totally deprived, I think we can reframe that into saying that we actually all have quite a few blessings. Number 2 is ponder a recent life lesson you've learned and be grateful for the opportunity that lesson may have presented you with. And at the moment, you probably didn't have that attitude about it, but looking back, you may find that actually kind of did some good things for you in terms of opening your eyes.
I did want to add something to that one, David. You know, a lot of addicts, myself included, will look back and list their bottom as on their gratitude list. You know, I hear things like, I'm grateful for flashing lights and handcuffs because it got me into recovery. I'm grateful that my wife threatened to divorce me because it got me into recovery. You know, I'm grateful for that horrible 6 months that we went through because it got me into recovery. So yeah, the life lesson, sorry, interrupted.
Right. No, and I could go on adding things. I've had clients for that HIV diagnosis. You know, who's grateful for HIV, but it saved their life as a drug addict. So yeah, I mean, we can take those things and really use them. Number 3 is make a goal to give to others daily, and keeping in mind that generosity is a huge part of gratitude. Number 4 was to focus on the best in others instead of the worst. I think, as I mentioned, these days, our kindness is at a limit, and we're kind of stretched, and we can be pretty harsh with each other and with ourselves. And I think just really being generous in terms of our spirit and our attitude toward others. Start viewing challenges and opportunities, as we just mentioned. And then finally, take time to think about the things you're thankful for. And that's that daily ritual, daily practice of gratitude, which I think is hugely beneficial.
And we had a question come in here, so we're grateful for the question. It came through in the chat feature, and I like this question a lot. How do I handle the barrage of justified abuse after betraying my partner? It has been days of getting beaten up emotionally. This is the betrayed partner is beating up the addict emotionally.
Yeah, I think, boy, that's a tough one, because partners really have been betrayed. They're looking for safety. They're angry. They've often been detectives. They've been trying to get this thing under control, and they are going to they're going to ventilate and talk about it. And I think, you know, I think for initially, I think you have to grin and bear it, because there's a lot of expression that has to be said, and there's probably an accumulation of it. At some point, if it kind of crosses the line into some kind of abuse, verbal abuse or physical abuse, which I've seen, that's not okay, obviously. And at some point, I think the berating is not productive either. So I would suggest, if you're not in couples therapy right now, get a couples therapist who can kind of guide you and be a referee, if nothing else, but also kind of give you some structure in terms of communication. How can your partner ventilate and express her rage or anger, but in a healthy way that actually works for her and works for you? Because that's going to be important. Oftentimes people, if they're just kind of venting and being angry, they're not feeling any better sometimes. It's just kind of more of the same. But there are ways to express that in a ways that, oh my God, that cat is so cute.
Steve is, yeah, he's the Zoom bomber.
He just totally stole the show. Anyway, I think, yeah, just to really, initially, you know, some of it's deserved. And then at a point, if it crosses the line, I think, and then you have to maybe get a third party to help you dialogue and make sure those feelings are expressed, but in a healthy way.
And some therapists will implement with their clients who are struggling like this, what they call a respectful conflict agreement. Like, you know, we won't have these loaded discussions before a certain hour or after a certain hour. We won't have them in front of the kids. We agree not to name call, you know, things like that. If we need a timeout for 15 minutes, we can take a timeout and then resume the discussion.
Exactly.
Things like that. You can mutually agree to some boundaries to make these conversations more productive rather than abusive, because nobody wants to be hammered on relentlessly. That doesn't do you any good. It doesn't do the relationship any good after a certain point. I mean, you know, yeah, if you've been betrayed, you get to vent. But there's a certain level where venting becomes abusive. So yeah, I encourage some boundaries. Okay, we've filled our hour. We've seen my cat. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Tomorrow is a great day to start a 30-day gratitude challenge. Come up, as David said, 5 things every day for 30 days. I find that sharing those 5 things on Facebook, since we had a question about social media, or with my sponsor or with my sponsees, or a family member, actually sort of drives it home in a way that just coming up with the list doesn't. So I encourage everyone to do that.
One other idea that I have that I'm in now and I'm really loving it, I have a little WhatsApp group of 10 of us that went through a little process together, and we share a gratitude list on that every day too. That's just a nice way to have it be witnessed.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. Have a great Thanksgiving. We will be back next week, and we'll see you then.
Take care, Scott. Bye.